Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 189, October 28th to November 3rd, 1864. Last week, we began Price's Missouri expedition. As opposed to an invasion, the majority of the command being cavalry would make it into more of a raid. Despite this, Thomas Ewing was able to deal a blow to the Confederate forces at Fort Davidson and Pilot Knob. We also talked about the sinking of the CSS Albemarle, one less ironclad the Confederates could use against the U.S. Navy. This week we will return to Missouri. We need to continue the campaign, including another Gettysburg of the West, aptly named Westport. Of course, before we do that, we need to talk about our Patreon content. And of course, we have some new episodes that have rolled out here. And as we get into November, we will have a new episode. We did a picture slideshow that was back from the Battle of the Crater that was happening earlier this year in the summer. And now we are moving back to a movie review. So we're doing Alvarez Kelly, which is actually depicting the events of the beefsteak raid that we talked about here a few episodes past in the Petersburg campaign. So we have that will be posted shortly. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, either our movie reviews, our memoir reviews, our picture slideshows, we have a couple other odds and ends episodes. All of that can be found. There is a link to the Patreon in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So when we last left off in Price's Missouri raid, things had not gone well at Fort Davidson. Not only were the attacks on that position repulsed, but the federal forces were allowed to escape. Price had considered bombarding the position into submission, but he was hampered by Shelby not being present with artillery, and that he had been informed that there were Confederate hostages in the fort itself. Confederate columns would chase Ewing to the town of Rolla, where they would be halted by the strong defensive works there. In the meantime, the rebels would be foraging off the land. You see, many of the men that had invaded the state had to be coerced to do so by the Confederate forces. Joe Shelby would famously convince, and I say convince in quotation marks, several men in the area to join up, former deserters, in fact, for the ride. As a result, there were many troops in the command with, let's just say, mixed motives. Some would turn to looting instead of simply foraging. This was also why the failure at Fort Davidson was so important. Not only was it a key delay to the mounted invasion, but also many of those being convinced to join up were ill-supplied. Capturing of the federal arms there would have gone a long way to arming Missouri recruits and the current Southerners in the command. While part of the rebels were concentrated on Ewing, Price would continue towards St. Louis, trying to get at that larger city. Now William S. Rosecrans had been made aware Price and Shelby had moved into Missouri, but so far there had been no real concentration of forces. The rebels were mounted, so they were moving quickly, and guerrillas were still all over the state. If he was to pull his troops into one position, then this would leave vulnerabilities. The question of what exactly Price's objective was surely on the mind of Rosecrans and the Federals. While we know on paper at least why Price is in Missouri, we might ask the same question of why he was allowed to go. Well, if you are Kirby Smith, you are being told to send men to the other theaters of the war. Not only was there really no easy way to do that, but also many of your men are not going to be willing to leave the Trans-Mississippi. We have seen this in other places of the war, in the main theater and sub-theater, shall we say, of individuals who are not willing to go other places to fight. We have a very famous example of the Antietam campaign, where there are a good amount of Confederate troops that don't cross the Potomac because they don't want to go into Maryland. There is no point of them, in their minds, to invade Maryland. It's a little bit of a different situation when the Gettysburg campaign comes along, but they've won all these battles, at least at that point in the war in 1862. They had won all these battles. They had defended Richmond. There was a huge victory at Second Manassas, and then we can just kind of sit on our laurels. That's kind of like the thinking behind some of these men who refuse to go into Maryland. We also have other examples of individuals. When Vicksburg falls, there's a very large amount of Mississippi troops that will desert or otherwise just go home, right? Tennessee and Georgia, you already have experienced that. There are a lot of individuals who are even changing sides, really, but they are deserting, going home. So if you're taking these troops that are local to Louisiana, Arkansas, and then you're like, hey, go to the sub-theater of the war, let's say, let's join Hood in his campaign in Tennessee, let's join Robert E. Lee in the defense of Petersburg, none of that is going to sound appealing. Remember, too, that Kirby Smith is really going to enjoy independent command. We saw that all the way back in the Heartland campaign with Braxton Bragg. He doesn't want to join up with Bragg because Bragg is going to be his superior. And you could actually point that as an argument that, Perryville could have gone a lot differently if there had been additional Confederate troops on the field, right? But he is not going to want to necessarily bend the knee to another Confederate general, and he wants to consolidate his power, and the power that he has is holding these troops in the Trans-Mississippi. The problem for Kirby Smith, though, is that he really just can't do nothing. He needs to do something. So we can see why Price, much like John Hunt Morgan, is getting intelligence that if an invasion were to happen, then many men would join them. Smith is going to doubt that this intelligence is accurate, and so no infantry is going to be accompanying the journey. Could it have been a successful raid? Well, maybe. But was it just kind of a distraction as well? More probably. Price has a way of bumping heads with other officers, and even the president of the Confederacy, so maybe it's a way to kind of get rid of him. Whatever the reason, as Price approached St. Louis, he would decline an attack, and then head to Jefferson City, where he would also decline an assault. St. Louis had been allowed to build up some defense, and without his full complement of troops, it would seem ill-advised. Jefferson City might have been taken, but intelligence would report that some 15,000 Federals were defending the seat of government, and the gun-shy Price, from his experience at Fort Davidson, would likewise decline. So not taking Jefferson City on October 7th, Price would move toward Boonville on October 13th. You might remember Boonville as being a strong pro-Confederate city from the early days of the war. From here, the welcomed rebels would be joined by some guerrillas. We have talked before about how the regular Confederate army would be pretty shocked to see the unusually clad and heavily armed guerrillas with scalps on their saddles. This would possibly actually be trophies from Centralia. We talked about Centralia. That happens there in September. Price would then see victories at nearby Glasgow and Saladia, capturing garrisons and much-needed supplies, so there would be some morale boosts. But Rosecrans was not going to remain idle. A.J. Smith had arrived with combat veterans to chase the rebels, although they were all infantry. These men were experienced with dealing with enemy cavalry, though, if you recall having dealt a blow to Forrest at Tupelo. Some of the command had been present with Ewing at Fort Davidson, helping to hold off the enemy there. Alf Pleasanton would be tasked with matching the Confederates in building up a mounted arm. He would form a provisional division of mounted troops, mostly Missouri militia, with brigades under Egbert Brown, John McNeil, who you remember as being a primary protagonist against guerrillas, and John Sanborn. Sanborn, if you remember, had served at Iuka, Corinth, and the Vicksburg campaign. In his brigade would also be John Phillips, commanding the loyal Arkansas troops. Edward Winslow would also command a brigade, the New York native and railroad executive, having served in campaigns in the West. Under him would also be Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Benteen, who's probably more famous as being part of the 7th Cavalry, fighting at the Little Bighorn. Also joining the converging of troops would be Samuel Curtis and his border army, sporting a division of Kansas militia and one under our old friend James Blunt. Blunt's brigade commanders would include Charles Jennison, Thomas Moonlight, Charles Blair, and James Hobart Ford. Jennison was a Jayhawker who was struck back following Lawrence. Moonlight was a Scot by birth who would go on to serve against natives in the West before going into politics. Blair was born in Ohio, moving to Kansas and practicing law before the war. Ford has actually been in our story before, commanding Colorado troops responding to the rebel invasion of New Mexico. The ever-aggressive Blunt would move his forces to the town of Lexington on October 17th, hoping to keep Price out of Kansas. You see, gathering of cattle, supplies, and maybe looting was going to be on the agenda for the rebels. If you combine that with the fact that there are Jayhawkers across the border, and perhaps some scores to settle, then realizing that a rebel army moving into Kansas would probably be less than ideal. You can also probably argue as well that in Missouri you have these targets at St. Louis, Jefferson City. These are going to be battlegrounds, former battlegrounds, or very key cities that have defense systems set up. You're probably seeing softer targets in Kansas, right? You kind of were shown that with the Lawrence raid. However, Lawrence did have some defenses that were just not particularly manned very well, but they're probably softer targets, bigger scores. Maybe if Price can get in there, wreak some havoc, that's going to pull some troops out of Missouri. Maybe it's going to pull some recruits into his cause as well. Blunt's forces would build up defenses and meet with their enemy on the 18th. Price would launch attacks that would see progress in pushing the enemy back. Blunt would move his forces through the town before deciding to set up defensively behind the Little Blue River. Thomas Moonlight's command had done a good job in acting as rearguard before the Federals made it to their defensive position. Curtis would disagree with Blunt as to how to proceed from there. It could have been possible for Pleasanton's command, who was trailing the rearguard of the rebels, and remember that they were laden down with spoils of war, so they're moving slow, to actually capitalize and catch the rebels in kind of a pincer movement. Curtis would call Blunt with the majority of his command to Independence, leaving Moonlight and some 400 men, including the 11th Kansas at the Little Blue River. Curtis would return Blunt's forces, but not before Price was getting the better of the defenders. Moonlight's outnumbered command had put together a tough resistance, burning the key bridge over the river that would have given the rebels a better crossing. As it was, though, the waterway was fordable, and so the rebels were working into the flanks of their enemy, forcing the men away from the high ground. Mountain howitzers would keep the mounted rebels at bay, allowing for the dismounted Union troops to move in an orderly fashion back. Blunt would arrive on the scene, seeing that the rebels not only had taken the opposite bank, but they were actually now driving Moonlight's ammunition-depleted men. He would filter his men into the fight, using artillery to good advantage, having better ground than the attacking Confederates. His dismounted men would actually do good work in pushing back Marmaduke in the center of the line, as far as a mile back. But Shelby was filing in on the right of Marmaduke, and more Confederates were gaining on the left. Despite a charge by the 2nd Colorado Cavalry, which saw its major killed, Curtis, who had arrived on the scene, would order a retreat. His men would move back to the Big Bully River, pulling out of the town of Independence in the process, although there were some troops of Blunt left to delay the Confederates. Some fighting would erupt in the town itself, with a key jail filled with potential guerrillas liberated by the Southerners. The fight at the Little Blue is considered to be its own entity, but also really the beginning of the Battle of Westport. Now, Westport did have some importance to the settling of the American West. For a time, Independence, Missouri was the jumping-off point for individuals heading out to the unsettled lands the United States had recently acquired. We have talked before about Independence, a raid having occurred there previously in the war. Westport led to independence, and so the town had grown as a result of the westward traffic, whether pioneers are moving to Oregon, Santa Fe, or homesteaders making good on their promise of land, or otherwise, or even gold in California and Colorado. During the war, it was also a jump-off point, as there was a migration to escape the violence. This actually did include Mark Twain and John Behan, who you might remember as the lawman who was kind of a punk in the movie Tombstone. Actually, if you are a Tombstone or maybe just a Western fan in general, then it may interest you to know that Wild Bill Hickok has served as a scout during the campaign. Buffalo Bill Cody also serves as a militiaman from Kansas. Liver-Eating Johnson, the inspiration for Jeremiah Johnson, serves in a Colorado unit, and reportedly Johnny Ringo may have rode with Joe Shelby. Due to its location close to Kansas City, there had been some relocation of pro-Confederates here. In fact, Jenison had intended of burning the town because of this, but was actually dissuaded. In October of 1864, this would be the center of our operations, now part of the suburbs of modern-day Kansas City. Samuel Curtis held the crossing of the Big Blue on the 22nd, but he would see a problem. His command was filled with Kansas militia, despite also having Blunt's capable battle veterans. The crossings of the river would have to be contested, but where Price would strike was the question. U.C. Price would still have 3 divisions to work with, as we have already alluded to. James Fagan would command a primarily Arkansas division, with William Cabell, already mentioned, taking the reins of one brigade, and the others commanded by Archibald Dobbins, William Slemons, and Thomas McCrae. Dobbins, we mentioned before, as being involved in the Marmaduke duel from a while back. Slemons will go on to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives for Arkansas, and McCrae had served in the 1862 Kentucky campaign under Thomas Churchill. We actually remember Churchill had done a good job at the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, which is considered one of the most one-sided affairs of the entire war. Marmaduke would have brigades under the already mentioned John Bullock Clark and Thomas Freeman. Shelby's Iron Brigade would be commanded by Jeff Thompson, resurging after being out of our story for a while, and a second brigade would be added to his division under Sidney Jackman, a Missouri border ruffian who will eventually escape to Mexico before relocating to Texas. Now, Byram's Ford would be guarded by Jennison's brigade from Blunt's command, a crossing of the Big Blue River. Price would opt to not take the main route toward his enemy, but send Jackman to Byram's while his force tried to get at Curtis. Originally, Jennison would hold, despite being pressured, several crossing attempts being thwarted. Eventually, Alonzo Slayback's battalion moving to a further crossing, before smashing into the federal flank, would break the defense. Jennison's command was therefore forced to retire, but would give stubborn defense when faced against Shelby. Additionally, artillery would make a firm stand at a farm, forcing the Confederates to charge and wipe out the command. Curtis was preparing to withdraw further into Kansas, but Blunt would convince him to reconsider, especially as Pleasant Head had finally arrived. Elements of McNeil's command would begin to skirmish with Fagan's troops in Independence. We have an eyewitness account of the fighting. I have braved a storm that is beyond all description. For the past 2 weeks, the Federals have been massing all the forces they could on the border to capture Price and his army. It is estimated they had some 15,000 or 20,000 men. 10,000 Kansas militiamen have been in camp here since Monday, also a regiment of Colorado troops. 3,000 of the militiamen were camped out on our lot from Monday until Friday evening, when they were ordered out to meet the rebels, as they called them. The fighting commenced about 9 o'clock in the morning, 6 miles from town on the Lexington Road. The Confederates were laboring under a great disadvantage, as the Federals had picked their ground and were entrenched beyond rock fences. The Confederates were forced to charge these fences. It would be impossible for me to tell you how many were killed and wounded, but I understand that in this engagement, the Federals' loss was greater than that of the rebels. George Todd, the famous guerrilla, was mortally wounded in one of the charges and died in town. Major Smith, a brave and courteous federal officer who had command of the post here for the past 8 months, was also killed. A great many other officers met a similar fate in the desperate fighting near town. General Curtis gradually fell back until about 5 o'clock in the evening. Then the Confederates entered Independence, and for a time, the fighting ceased. The Federals retreated to the Blue, the Confederates passing out as far as Rock Creek, where they rested a while, and then took up their march to meet the enemy. At midnight, we heard sharp fighting right in front of town. Price's rearguard was stretched across the country for 6 miles. General Pleasonton attacked it in the morning with 10,000 cavalry. The fighting lasted all day. The roaring of the cannon and the clash of small arms was terrific. I am told that the list of the dead and wounded is distressingly large. The Confederates began to retreat about 3 o'clock, fighting desperately every foot of the way. They passed through town again, firing with small arms at the oncoming Federals. The latter pushed so closely that at times they were not farther than 90 yards behind the Confederates. From the balcony in front of our house, which is very high, we had a clear view of the battle for more than a mile. We saw the Federals capture a battery in Noah Miller's field. It was magnificently defended, and no less bravely attacked. We could see the far-off flash of red fire coming out of the guns, and pistols and men fell by the dozens. It was one of the most sublimely thrilling sights that no one could imagine. From there on the Blue, the fighting was fierce. The opposing forces were so close together that they used small arms almost exclusively until they got to the Blue, when the cannonading commenced again. The guns would be wheeled into line with incredible swiftness, and almost before you could count, the grape and canister would be seeping into the face of the charging legions. It seemed like the fighting extended all around us. The smoke rose high and almost darkened the sky. So obviously, we have a couple things to unpack here, right? There is a good account of just kind of the chaotic nature of this fighting, but at the same time, I think it's indicative of the nature of the war in this region of the war, right? There's a lot of small arms that are being used. It's mentioned several times here in this account that that's primarily what they're using. So we're not using Napoleonic tactics anymore, right? This is kind of like a running fight, and it gives you an idea of that. And you can't help but wonder, right? It kind of harkens back to the early stages of the war here, that we are toward the end, how this kind of fighting would probably not have been a battle at all. There just would have kind of been just some chaos, and then both sides probably would have run away earlier in the war. However, you still see that even though there is some chaos, there is still discipline with the artillery rolling into position. By this point, they're pretty good at being able to do that, right? Especially if they're horse artillery, they're firing, they're limbering up, they're moving places, right? So they're very skilled at that by this point in the war. And the last thing that we need to unpack here is that George Todd, who's been in our story before as a guerrilla, he's going to be killed as mentioned in this campaign. Now, there I've seen some accounts that have mentioned how Todd didn't necessarily need to be doing what he was doing, whether he was kind of scouting ahead of the column, whether he was joining a charging column, right? They have pointed out that he really didn't need to be there, right? But you also have somebody who is used to just meeting the enemy head on, or used to doing things by themselves, and that's kind of the guerrilla way of life, right? We've talked about that in detail in other episodes, and certainly we had our segment on guerrillas a while back. But I think, too, we can also kind of equate it to, and everybody is different, so I'm not necessarily trying to generalize for everyone, but we can kind of equate it as well to when we talked about Ride with the Devil, and there are certain guys who just don't want to have the war end. They just can't give up, or they are not going to be able to acclimate back into civilian life, so they're going to kind of, when the writing is on the wall, kind of make sure that it's going to end, right? So that could have been a case here with George Todd. You're probably not going to be going back into civilian life normally. You're probably going to be looking at, and it's hard to tell, right? Hindsight 2020. But at this point in the war, you're probably saying, well, if the South is going to lose, I'm not going to be making it out of it, right? I'm going to be charged with war crimes or whatever. And obviously we know that there were really only 2 executions for the Confederacy following the war for war crimes. But it still might give you an idea of the mindset that this kind of individual is going through. On October 22nd, the Federals had pushed the Confederates out of Independence and back to Byram's Ford, where the rebels had set up defensively. The decisive showdown would be the following day. Pleasanton would attack and force a crossing of the Big Blue, while Blunt would also throw his forces at Price. The action would thus have two areas. The first would be Marmaduke in his strong defensive position at Byram's Ford, facing the attacking Pleasanton. Shelby would be primed for offensive action, but Curtis with his division under Blunt and another under Dietzler comprising the Kansas militia would be pressing on him from the north. Price had by this time built up a large wagon train, so he would task Cabell and send unarmed recruits with guarding it. October 23rd was recorded as being a cold morning, with Shelby forming past Brush Creek, facing north toward Westport. The Federals would be repulsed in an initial attack across the creek, being forced as far back as the town itself. Curtis would join Blunt in directing the efforts. Shelby was still ready with his Iron Brigade and some supporting units from Fagan. Attacking again, this time Curtis would be informed of a defile that could be used to flank the rebels. That's another interesting parallel to, say, Perryville and the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, right? That campaign. The Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, there is a wash, a defile that is used to actually great effect by the Confederates. The 9th Wisconsin would use this to terrible effect on Shelby, pouring fire into the Confederates, forcing the enemy to withdraw. Jennison would launch a charge that would smash into the Confederates, protecting a battery. By this time, the brigades of Jennison, Blair, and Ford were all pressing down on the Confederates. And additionally, it was apparent to Shelby that something had gone terribly wrong at Byram's Ford, as Pleasanton was also coming in from the east. Marmaduke had initially contested the crossing of the Big Blue River. His command had dealt casualties to the Federals as they tried the icy waterway, but eventually, as with the day before, the crossing defense was flanked out of its position. Marmaduke would set up with his main battle line on a strong piece of high ground. Pleasanton would use Winslow and Sanborn's brigades to attack this new Confederate line. William S. Rosecrans had initially instructed Alf to wait for A.J. Smith's infantry, still on their way to independence. The former cavalry leader for the Army of the Potomac, though, apparently did not get that order. Possibly also Alf Pleasanton is looking to seek some redemption, right? Remember, he was blamed. He's one of the 3 prongs of blame for the Battle of Chancellorsville. His cavalry do not raid properly into the rear of the Confederate Army. They do cause a little bit of havoc, but not to the effect that Joe Hooker wants. So he gets benched prior to the Battle of Gettysburg and finds his way, of course, out west. Instead, he had sent McNeil to try to cut off the retreat for Price's forces while assaulting the rebels. Sanborn and Winslow would put pressure on the flanks of Marmaduke, Winslow actually being wounded, and Frederick Benteen taking over command of the brigade. It would be the 10th Missouri of Benteen that would find a soft spot on the Confederate line and start to roll them up. Marmaduke's command would soon collapse against Pleasanton, his brigade from Freeman not being able to form as a rearguard. With Marmaduke and Fagan in full retreat, the only thing that could save Price's command would be Joe Shelby, forming enough of a defense to prevent total disaster. The Battle of Westport had ended with both sides seeing more than 1,500 casualties. But with Price at less than 10,000, and the combined Union forces now over 20,000, this would seem to be a losing fight for the Confederates. Once there had been aspirations of even moving into Kansas, taking Kansas City and then Leavenworth, but these would all be dashed with a defeat at Westport. While the battle was over, the campaign would not be. Price was still needing to escape. So the problem with the escape of Price and his Army of Missouri would be the loot that they had acquired during the expedition. Besides wagon loads of stuff, there was also beef cattle that had been secured by the Confederates. This would mean the going was going to be slow, especially at river crossings. Curtis would mount a pursuit, wishing to destroy the rebels. Skirmishing would occur on the 24th and 25th as the Federals approached Price. Price, though, must not have believed there was as much danger. Having moved along the border and into Kansas, Joe Shelby was dispatched in the direction of Fort Scott, as it was assumed that maybe the border fort could be taken. Marmaduke and Fagan would set up along Mine Creek defensively. In the meantime, Frederick Benteen and John Phillips would arrive and see the rebel line as flawed. The artillery was too close to the front, so an aggressive action might win the day. The commands would launch an assault that would initially waver due to the heavy small arms fire. The 4th and 3rd Iowa of Benteen's command would continue the charge, smashing into the Confederate line. Freeman's brigade had left the field altogether, them having already failed as a rearguard at Byram's Ford. Hand-to-hand fighting would erupt, but the Confederates would flee the field. Marmaduke and Cabell would both be made prisoner by the attacking Federals. In the meantime, Shelby would be recalled from his journey toward Fort Scott. Again, his command was able to perform decently in a rearguard action. The Confederates had again suffered large casualties, mostly uncaptured, some 1,200, a large number compared to the overall command. Curtis may have aggressively destroyed Price, but the bureaucracy and logistics of the hodgepodge forces would rear their ugly head. Many of the Kansans would be released to go back to their home state so they could take part in elections. The Missouri troops likewise would look at being recalled. Pleasanton would not be technically subordinate to Curtis, taking his commands from Rosecrans, so his forces would start to move toward Fort Scott to refit. Curtis, meanwhile, would argue with Alf, wanting to continue the pursuit. Eventually, the Federals would catch up with the Confederates again at Newtonia, the site of an 1862 battle we talked about in a previous episode. Joe Shelby again would form his command into a strong defensive position, protecting the army as they continued their trek south. Reportedly, the frustration would be taken out on a lieutenant of the Federal garrison there, him being killed under possible dubious circumstances, before reportedly being scalped or otherwise mutilated by some of the more irregular rebels. The battle would open with artillery as Ford's and Jennison's brigades would arrive on the field. The Federals would launch several attacks, but the Confederates would hold, and Shelby, with a strong command, would threaten the enemy flanks. A Colorado soldier would colorfully describe the action. The rebels had planted a battery in their rear that was throwing shell with considerable precision into the midst of our troops, but notwithstanding the fierce storm of lead and hail from the enemy's guns that thinned our ranks, and stilled the pulsations of many a noble heart, they stood firm and undaunted. And when the order to fire was given, the long line of curling smoke, the rattling, crackling, crashing of the carbines in the hands of our men, that hurled leaden messengers of death into the ranks of the foe, and the deep thunder tones of our batteries, that belched forth shot and shell, spake full many a traitor's doom, and served to check their impetuous advance, and cause them to fall back in confusion, but only to return to the charge with increased numbers and greater determination. At 4:30, the battle was raging in all its fury. The inspiring cheers of the combatants, the constant roar of artillery, and the incessant rattle of the firearms that dealt death and destruction on either side, the clashing of sabers, mingling with the death cries of the fallen, and the shouts of the officers in giving commands, the galloping to and fro of couriers carrying orders, all tended to make the scene one of the thrilling interest and exciting in the extreme. We've had some pretty colorful accounts of combat and the Civil War just in general, but this has to be one of the more poetic and colorful accounts, especially probably, and maybe takes the cake for the most colorful account of this region, the Trans-Mississippi. It is very interestingly written there. Shelby would form his Confederates for an attack and attempt to use a cornfield to flank them. Curtis, in the meantime, would arrive on the field with Sanford's brigade, though, so this would be foiled, and the Southerners would be forced back. Both sides would claim victory, the rebels having seemingly gotten the best of their pursuers, but also losing the field. Casualties are hard to tell, maybe some 250 on both sides, but the main headline is that Shelby again saves Price and the Confederates, and allows them to continue further south. After Second Newtonia, Price's expedition essentially ends. His troops will make it to northwest Arkansas, stopping in Fayetteville by November, and move through modern-day Oklahoma. They would make it to southern Arkansas by December 2nd. This action would essentially end the operations in the Trans-Mississippi as well. Ironically, more federal troop presence would also extinguish the guerrilla operations to a degree. Todd had died during the campaign, with Bloody Bill and Quantrill soon to follow. Now, it is possible the expedition might have been better supported by Kirby Smith, but overall, Price loses track of what his goal should be. Is it an invasion or a raid? His army does a good job of gaining supplies, but would waste time in key areas, allowing for a federal response. He also might have been able to tap into the irregular soldiers a little bit more. The federal response was solid, although not without its flaws too. No one really took overall operational control. We've seen it elsewhere during the war, where this is a death sentence, but the Union are able to get away with it. Overall, I think it's really just an example of how the numbers are not going the way of the Confederacy anymore. So let's go ahead and stop there. We have played out Price's expedition and fought a Gettysburg of the West at Westport, which was really more of a string of engagements than one set-piece battle. We will sort of say goodbye to Missouri, or at least conventional warfare there for the time being. Next week, we will mop up on anything we have missed. Notably, we will head to Arkansas, Virginia, and Tennessee. Additionally, we have the hammer dropping politically for the South. We have the re-election of Abraham Lincoln. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.